Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this event of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis University. My name is Alexander Kay. I am the Stoll Family Chair of Israel Studies at Brandeis. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to our session today on the subject of protests, panthers, and politics, rethinking Blackness in Israel. Now, just a brief word about the title and the topic of the talk today. It's well known, I hope, that Blackness, when we talk about the term Blackness, we're talking not about a real thing in the world, but about what we call a social construct, an idea, a way that people have devised to talk about themselves and other people in society and other things in general. And Blackness as a category of thought has been put to all kinds of uses historically. In the United States, for example, Blackness, or really anti-Blackness, has been used in all kinds of insidious ways as a foundation of one of the kind of central myths of anti-Black racism in this country. And it's also been a source of tremendous empowerment and cultural creativity. What we're going to be talking about today is the way that this term is used and thought about in the context of Israel, how people in Israel have used it to think about, to define themselves and other people, and what uses it's been put to in Israeli society, and the way that the idea of Blackness in Israel has commonalities, but also differences with the way that the same term and idea is used in Europe, the United States, Africa, and other places. And to do this very complex work, we are joined by just a tremendous panel who I will introduce now. First of all, I'd like to introduce Dr. Yuval Evry, who is the Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at King's College in London. And Yuval's work focuses on the cultural and political history of Palestine and the land of Israel, and especially on Sephardi and Arab Jewish thought. He has a book just out with Magnus Press called The Return to Al-Andalus, Disputes over Sephardic Culture and Identity Between Arabic and Hebrew. I also want to say with some excitement that Yuval is going to be joining the Brandeis faculty this coming year. So hopefully you'll be seeing and hearing a lot more from him through the Schusterman Center. We're also joined this morning by Dr. Shula Mola, who is an educational content developer, workshop leader, and researcher focusing on civics, tolerance, inequality, and multiculturalism. Shula is a founding member of Mothers on Guard, which is an NGO dedicated to reducing police brutality against Ethiopian Israeli youth, and is also a former chairperson of the Association of Ethiopians and Jews in Jerusalem. Finally, we are joined by Dr. Brian K. Roby, who is an assistant professor of Judaic and Middle Eastern studies at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Brian's expertise is on Middle Eastern and North African Jewish history in the modern period, focusing on the intersections of race, gender, and sexuality in Israel-Palestine, and in the 19th and 20th century in North Africa, and also on the legacy of French colonialism on Arab and Jewish identity. His first book is called The Mizrahi Era of Rebellion, Israel's Forgotten Civil Rights Struggle, 1948 to 1966. Now, how today is going to work is, first of all, I'm going to ask Dr. Evry to give an overview of the big themes and ideas that are going to root and anchor our discussion. He's going to speak for 8-10 minutes, something like that. And then I'll pose some questions to all of our panelists in turn. We are going to leave a good chunk of time at the end of the session for the panelists to address your questions that are coming from the audience. And to submit questions, you'll notice that there is no Q&A function on this call, but there is a chat function, and you should feel free to use the chat as you want. And that's the way to submit questions for us to address. At the end of the session, we're going to be joined by Dr. Shana Weiss, who is the Associate Director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies, and she's going to be moderating the questions. And I also need to add that we now have live captioning on this Zoom call, and you are able to set your own settings for how you see the live captioning on the bottom of your screen with the icon that says live transcript. So with that, let me ask Dr. Avery to kick us off.
Thank you very much, Alex, for these kind words and introduction. And thank you, and Shaina, for the invitation to participate in this really important event. This is my first event in Brandeis, and I'm looking forward to joining you in Boston next year, next summer. So the theme of our event today is very much in line with the current events in Israel. In the past year, we have been witnessing a series of demonstrations in Israel known as the Balfour protests that received extensive media coverage with footage of police violence against demonstrators. The images of the violence against the predominant white privileged Jewish demonstrators provoked a critical discussion around the issue of police violence. While police violence is a new experience for privileged white Jews, for non-white Jews and Arabs in Israel, this police brutality is known for many years and is part of their day-to-day lives. The issue of police brutality should be examined as part of a broad discussion about institutional racism in Israel. One of the main targets of police violence in recent years have been young men, mainly from the Ethiopian community in Israel. Activists identified a clear racist tendency among law enforcement officials to incriminate young Black Ethiopians and to use disproportional violence against them. The death of 18-year-old Solomon Teka at the hands of an Israeli police officer during the summer of 2019 was a breaking point and provoked multiple protests across the country. Protests against institutional racism, against police violence, and against inequality and discrimination based on their skin color. These protests were also related and connected to a wider context of localized and globalized discourse of resistance. The rise of the Black Lives Matter movement in the US and Europe against police violence was an influential factor that helped shape the language and the intensity of the protest as part of global movement and discourse, and increased the numbers of young people outside the Ethiopian community who joined these demonstrations for the first time. Alongside this, one can also identify the echoes and traces of the Mizrahi struggle in Israel and of the Black Panthers movement in particular. These traces reveal a more rooted and systematic apparatus which links Blackness with questions of racism and inequality in Israel. Symbolically, we mark this year the 50th anniversary of the formation of the Black Panthers movement in Israel. Formed in 1971 in the Muswara neighborhood in Jerusalem, the Panthers consisted of mostly second-generation Mizrahi teenagers and youth demanding equal rights and an end to the widespread racism and discrimination against the Mizrahi community in Israel. This movement, which was active for several years and spread across Mizrahi neighborhoods and communities in Israel, had a long-lasting impact on the Israeli society and discourse. As the name of the movement also indicates, the movement was also influenced by another global movement that emerged as part of the struggle for Black liberation in the United States in the 1960s. Like their American counterparts, the Israeli Black Panthers wanted to combine the struggle for civil rights with class struggle. The renewed discussion around the history and heritage of the Black Panthers in Israel today invites us to rethink and reconceptualize the connection between Blackness, racism, and social inequality in Israel within a globalized and localized settings and in relation to multiple geographical and historical contexts. So in the time that I have left, I will try to offer some initial thoughts and questions regarding the question of Blackness in Israel. So as Alex started in the beginning of his introduction, when we're talking about Blackness in Israel, it is important to stress that Blackness is a social construct. And therefore, the groups that are included in this category change over time. Blackness, like race, is a product of social forces and manifested itself across different ethnic and racial categories. It can serve as an analytical tool to think of and represent social inequality, and as a symbolic boundary in the construction of social hierarchies. Moreover, Blackness in Israel is always created in relation to whiteness. It is impossible to understand the history of Blackness in Israel without the history of whiteness and vice versa. More precisely, Blackness and whiteness constitute each other in a constant process of blackening and whitening along the color spectrum. One of the roots of the discourse of Blackness and whiteness in Israel-Palestine dates back to the depiction of the Jew in Europe as non-whites, and in some cases even as Blacks or even white Negroes. This depiction was part of the Jewish history of racialization and persecution in Europe, and in the creation of the Jewish question in Europe during the second half of the 19th century. It is not surprising then that one of the main factors in the process of modernization and integration of Jews in Europe and Western societies was based on an active whitening process of Jewish identity and culture. In the case of the Zionist movement in Palestine and later in the Israeli state, the European Jews imagined themselves as white by blackening the Mizrahim and the Palestinians. By identifying themselves as white, Ashkenazi Jews in Israel attempting to transform their historical role in most Western and particularly European culture as the significant other and the outsiders. This whitening process is a part effort to positioning themselves in the world as neither Asians or Orientals or Middle Easterns, but as a Western and European, meaning white, part of the white world. This process is not unrelated to the process of whitening of Jewish identity and culture and the complex relations of whiteness and Jewishness in the US and Europe today. Despite the blackening and labeling as blacks placed upon Mizrahim from outside by the Ashkenazi establishment, from early stages, Mizrahi intellectuals embraced blackness and global black thought as language of resistance and as means of empowerment and as a political and cultural platform. Evidence of this affinity can be found as early as the 1940s and 1950s, several decades before the establishment of the Black Panthers movement. This is a great example of how categories of race travels and translated through time and space. The connection to global black thought as the connection to global black thought expanded the language of the Mizrahi struggle and positioned it within a broader transnational context. But however, the identification with the experience of Blacks in the United States, which has also become a common comparative, I think very important comparative framework among scholars of Mizrahi struggle in academia, has the danger to only intensify the detachment of the Mizrahi history from the Middle East and the Middle Eastern context, and further separate it from the local relation and connection to the social reality and struggle of the Palestinians in Israel. So the renewed discussion around the 15th anniversary of the Black Panthers movement is a good opportunity to rethink these connections and separations, to suggest new ways to investigate Blackness in Israel in the intersections of the localized Middle Eastern context, as well as the globalized discourse on race, color, and inequality. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Yuval, for the great overview of some of these complex themes. Ryan, I'm going to turn to you first. Yuval has already said a word about the way that whiteness in Europe had a very kind of complicated relationship to European Jews, and how much more so to Jews who came from places that were nowhere near Europe. I'd be interested to hear your reflections on how the identity of whiteness and also blackness changed over time in Israel with regard to Jews of European descent, but especially with regard to Mizrahim. At what point did Mizrahim start thinking, using blackness as a category to describe their own situation in the world? And at what point did people who are not Mizrahim use the term blackness to think about them? And finally, just another thing to reflect on as you speak, many of the people watching, not all, but many of the people watching are familiar with discourses around blackness in the United States, in Europe, and so on. And Mizrahim have had a kind of complicated relationship with that, with the way that term has been used in these other places. So if you could fold that into the discussion as you want as well. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. I'm probably going to ask you to remind me of that last question because it's very important, but I might forget as I start talking. So the first thing I'll say, Yuval, great job. I really like how you framed all of that. That's really fantastic. And the weird thing about Zionism and the state of Israel is that racial structures don't really map on to geographical ideas about race globally. But this is the only thing that I would say is really unique about Israeli society, but it allows us to actually think more clearly and explicitly that blackness is a construct, whiteness is also as well, and it's very fluid depending on time and location. And so we have, people who in other contexts would be considered, let's say, Soviet Jews, but in the Israeli case, they're, Gruzinim or Bukharan, and they're kind of black in a way, right? Despite being from, Soviet Russia. And so that kind of, helps us to complicate as scholars a little bit more. In terms of, where this started, I would really place the blame on kind of two entities in a way. First being colonialism. I'm always happy to point my finger at colonial powers for lots of problems in the world. And in the Israeli case, or with Zionism, that would be French colonialism first and foremost, but then also British and German colonial aspirations. And that's mostly because a lot of what we as scholars know, and people in general know about Mizrahi culture or the Beta Israel Ethiopian Jews is through this production of knowledge that occurs in the early 20th century, whereas Ashkenazi scholars who are Zionists are really the only people who are producing knowledge and kind of drive the narrative about what are these people's histories. This idea that we're discovering a lost tribe of Jewish communities and things like that. And so in this early period, we have a few figures, Yitzhak Ben Zvi, the first president, being one of them, who really creates this idea of this separate racial category of Jews, particularly in North Africa, Yemen, and to a certain extent, Asia as well. But then we also have people like Arthur Rupin, who takes it to a scientific racial level in scholarship, where he's very clearly, and this is a German Zionist Jewish scholar, who's very clearly in all of his works actually creating the hierarchies that we see now, the racial hierarchies amongst Jews. Whereas he's saying, well, Jews at their core are white and part of the Nordic racial structure. But then we also have these like foreign Jews and special types of Jews, as he called them. And those are mostly North African and Ethiopian Eritrean Jews, origin Jews. And so that's kind of where it starts in that early period. People start taking it on. One of the most kind of famous, I think, popular or ways to distribute this ideology in a popular scene in the Yishuv period is that of Herman Lersky, who writes, who kind of is a photographer and a filmmaker who produces these works called Everyday Faces, sometimes called Jewish Faces, and then Jews and Arabs. And in those works, it's all just, people's profiles. They're beautifully done. I have to admit they really are. But what he's highlighting is very Eurocentric. He's highlighting aspects of Jewishness that are based around the nose and the facial profile. And throughout these works, he really kind of looks at, he shows Yemenite Jews, Bukharan Jews, other types of Jews like that, and then like juxtaposes them with European Ashkenazi Jews. And through the light work, and so if you ever look it up, you can see he's very much into like light and darkness and where to put shadows and things like that. We can see already a production of categorizing Mizrahim, broadly construed, as Black, and Ashkenazim as white, or at least in the European Western context of how people, perceive of whiteness. So yeah, I think that answers most of the questions. There was another one that I...
Yes, so this is the moment for me to remind you, as you asked me to do. So you talked brilliantly about how through these colonial influences, these really sort of invidious pseudo-scientific racial ideas, false pseudoscience racial ideas came to kind of infect some Zionist ideology. We've also seen, though, and Yuval mentioned this, that Blackness has been a tool for empowerment among different communities. And your area of expertise in the Mizrahi community. One of the kind of parts of this talk subtitle is the Panthers. So as Yuval mentioned, the Black Panthers was a social resistance movement and empowerment movement that was created among Jews of Middle Eastern and North African origin in Israel to resist the power structures that they experienced as oppressing them, and drew kind of self-consciously on the Black Panthers in the United States. Can you just say a word about the kind of international exchange of ideas around these ideas of Blackness, whether it was self-conscious or whether it kind of came through other kinds of cultural influence, and how that operated?
Yeah, I would start off by saying that when we decenter Israel and Zionism, when learning and kind of speaking about Jewish communities worldwide, we get a better perspective on Jewish communities. The Mizrahi category is very much an Israeli invention, and it's tough to kind of like detach ourselves from that. But within these various different communities, let's say in North Africa, broadly speaking, we have, historically speaking, their own racial structure at place, right? That is in relationship to French colonialism. In Yemen, that's in relationship to British colonialism. And so when Jews migrated to the state of Israel, even to Palestine, Mandate Palestine, it was very confusing to be called Black or to be called other in a sense, right? The perspective of, let's say, Moroccan Jews throughout the first half of the 20th century was that, well, yeah, there's Black Jews like in the US who were, descendants of slaves, or there's Black Jews elsewhere. Why are you calling me that, right? And so we see this process of blackening and whitening in which, the Mizrahi case of Blackness helps to bolster the whiteness of European Ashkenazi Jews in Israel, who, while in Europe, historically speaking, were Black in themselves. And so it was just kind of, this great Black foil of like, using Mizrahim as this case. In later years, so I'll say like, already in the 50s and 60s, we see, as I mentioned in my first book, the kind of embracing of Blackness by Mizrahi migrants. Whereas, it was likely offensive to many people, particularly because of the word choices that were used to denigrate Mizrahim as Black. But you have this in terms of protest, and then the kind of popularity of the American civil rights struggle, internationally speaking. By the 60s, we have people like Eliyahu Eshar, who is a Sephardic origin person, and all means, in the early 20th century, he would have been a white guy, a white Jewish guy, a Palestinian, of course, but yeah. But he starts to use these terms of like, we don't want another Uncle Tom in the Knesset. We're fighting our own struggle. We too shall overcome. All of these things that, are, clearly taken from the Black civil rights struggle in the US and put in place as a tool and vocabulary usage to understand Mizrahi frameworks of that. For Ethiopians, although in the early 20th century, we do have lots of writings, particularly by Jacques Fetlovich, writing about Ethiopian Jews or discovering them in a sense, right? Which is a very problematic framework. We do have until the 80s, really, there's no like consciousness about this community of Jews as anything other than other, right? And that means that there's no scholarly engagement with their history, with their culture, with their society, their framework within Ethiopian society at large. And then when, the majority of whom are in Israel now come in the 80s and 90s, then it's like, oh yeah, they're Black, right? Clearly, right? Their skin tone looks like, any other kind of, African in a sense. With Mizrahim, that happened with Moroccans in particular, whereas, it was like, oh yeah, they're Black, they don't look like me in a sense. And so there's kind of like this, I don't want to call it conflict between Blackness, but there becomes a complication of what it means to be Black and Jewish in Israel, because there's an immediate, response from both American and Israeli Jews that Ethiopians are Black, even though that is not part of the framework of how they understood themselves in Ethiopia or in the first generation of the migration that happened in the 80s and 90s.
That's super, thank you. And that actually leads beautifully onto the next set of questions that I'm going to turn to Shula to ask. And before I do that, I just want to mention that several people in the chat have been asking specifically to you, Brian, if you could, in fact, I'm just going to ask you to type so that people can see the name of the photographer that you mentioned into the chat. And people have been asking about if we could follow up offering the titles of books and other resources that have been mentioned here. And we'll look into doing that, perhaps adding them to the website regarding this event or something like that. And Dr. Weiss will help me talk about how that can be done when we turn to questions at the end. Okay, Shula. So why your perspective on this, I think, is going to be particularly helpful, is that you are both a scholar and a researcher and also an activist in Ethiopian Israeli life. So let me first ask you a kind of historical question and then sort of move in a little bit to the present. In the 1980s and 90s, of course, there was a very significant immigration of Ethiopian Jews to Israel. Ethiopian Jews in Africa did not refer to themselves as Black, and then they arrived in Israel to find that they were. I'd be interested to hear your perspectives. First of all, how did perspectives of Africa, as understood, we've heard about the colonial influences on the early Zionist movement and so on, how did that help shape the way that Israelis saw this newly immigrant population of Ethiopians in the 80s and 90s? And how did that population then adjust to this way that Blackness was being used by others and sometimes by themselves to understand their own situation? Don't forget to unmute Shula.
Shula, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah. Okay. First of all, I want to say thank you for this opportunity to be part of this very important webinar to discuss the most complicated issue in the world, at least in my world. The longer I am in Israel, my Black identity becomes stronger. In Ethiopia, I was not considered Black at all. I was considered Tayyim, means brown. The color of the people in my village was Kay, red, brown, and light brown. Generally, I would say there were no people considered Black or white. So our story, Beta Israel story, the name that we call ourselves in Ethiopia means home of Israel. So the Beta Israel story in Israel reflects the process of the formation of blackness. Our blackness was created in an encounter with the whiteness of the other Jews in Israel. Following this, I want to say that Israel is not different from other Western countries, like Yuval mentioned it, and Brian. It absorbed ideological base from values of modernism and enlightenment from the mid-19th century, and joined to the group of Western countries since the State of Israel was founded. And Western countries, as all we know, with background of colonialism, human trafficking, and the grouping of groups according to physical and cultural characteristics. However, Israel as a state seeking to maintain national unify with all the Jewish diaspora has refrained from discussing skin color or race. This is despite the fact that in practice, Yuval mentioned before, right? From the beginning, the skin tones was linked to the cultural capital and established social order. As Professor Henriette Dahan-Kalev, the Mizrahi scholar, wrote an article in 2000, the article called "You Are Beautiful, You Don't Look Moroccan." Dahan-Kalev tells how she used her bright color and green eyes to make her way into the dominant group, to the Ashkenazim, like to pass. This passing in generally to one direction, as you know, from blackness to whiteness. Also, my friends mentioned before the Israeli Black Panther active wake up early 70s. As you know, and we all know, this name took from like a Black Panther from America, and they demand equality regarding race. They start to speak about racism. It was loudly. Before that, both in public and academic discourse, didn't really bring up the race discourse. The whole problems between Ashkenazim and Mizrahim was like absorption crisis and cultural gap, and not racial problem. But with the arrival of Ethiopian immigrants to Israel, the discourse needed to change. The dark color body made aliyah. And it's not anymore the symbolic blackness of the North African immigrants. It's about the concrete blackness, concrete color and clear color of body. And I should mention the discussion about the color of the Beta Israel, about Ethiopian Jews, began long before their aliyah, our aliyah. Their skin color was used by both those who were against the aliyah, who claimed that because of the blackness of the community, there is no affiliation with Jews and Judaism. And the others who support the aliyah claimed that stopping the community from coming to Israel because of their color would testify against Jewish world and against State of Israel. Indeed, the position of Israel from Rupin, like Brian mentioned before, who said they have no blood relationship to Jews. And through Ben Gurion, Moshe Sharet, Golda, and Rabin, they all didn't agree to let the community to come to Israel. Sorry. Dr. Yosef Littbach wrote a report behalf of the government and said, it will be a big mistake to let the Falasha to come to Israel. I bring a quote. Certainly, Littbach said, certainly for the benefit of the Falashas themselves. Falasha is the name that our neighbors called us in Ethiopia, and it's really negative term, but this is a term that scholars, including Littbach, Dr. Littbach used, and he said, certainly for the benefit of the Falashas themselves and for the benefit of Israel. Any plans to bring them to Israel should be completely abandoned. And he wrote more, the differences and the color barrier of the skin may serve as a fermenting element and loaded with potentially dangerous. So the physical presence of the dark body disrupt the order. Therefore, it is necessary to be changed, to make transformation from the demanding for full conversion at the first, despite the decision of Chief Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, who recognized the community's Judaism, an aggressive move of re-education while forgetting the community's heritage and tradition, and also thousands of children, our children, who suffered from biased diagnosis that marked them and sent them to special education track. I won't mention the blood affair. It was a big deal, big crisis for my community. On January 24th in 1966, the journalist Ronald Fisher, in the Hebrew Daily Ma'ariv, revealed that for the past 12 years, the Israeli blood bank, Magen David Adom, had been destroyed blood donation made by Ethiopian Israelis. I myself, I remember that day. I was a young activist who tried to figure out how to act and what to say about problems that our community faced. And then on January 24th, thousands of people, young and adult, came to Jerusalem in front of Prime Minister's office with a sign, one people, one blood, and our blood is red. It was so symbolic. At the same time, the community, especially the young, trying to be like them, like white Israelis, to be part of the Israeli. But then the blood bank administration came and put in the front of us the boundary between Ethiopian Israeli and other Israelis, between black and whites. During the years, the illusion that we can cross the boundaries of color and become one blood began to break. There is two reasons from my perspective. One is the entry of more and more Ethiopian citizens into academia and exposure to Black discourse around the world. And the second reason is many community members living in poor neighborhoods and experience discrimination from institutions, especially police violence. A current example, police violence that Yuval mentioned before. It's Yehuda Biadge and Solomon Turka, two young black Israeli men. Yehuda was 24 and Solomon 18 years old. They were killed by policemen on the same year in 2019. So for the conclusion of this part, I would say a community which refrained from adopting a discourse of race in the first decades after arrival in Israel, today sees racism as explanation of the injustice and inequality in Israel.
Sure, thank you so much. I'm going to ask you a question now about the place of Palestinians, both in Israel and also in the occupied territories in this conversation. And Shula, perhaps you'll briefly start us off with the answer. I want to try and end within the next few minutes to leave time for questions. So Shula, maybe you'll say a word or two about this, and Brian then, and Yuval if you want to chip in, and then we'll move to questions. But I want to make sure that this is asked because it's a very important issue. For some people, both activists among Jews and Palestinians in Israel, and also activists in the United States and other places, Palestinian activists and many in the Black Lives Movement, draw a relationship between the oppression of Palestinians in Israel and the oppression of people of color in the United States and make an argument of solidarity on the basis of intersectionality and shared oppression. And what Shula was just saying about the kind of the pathway to freedom from oppression being kind of passing into white Israeli society does raise the question of whether that passing is available to some people and not to other people. And is it available to Palestinians, or is in fact the contrast between some groups and Palestinians actually what enables them or helps them to kind of differentiate themselves into a passing direction? Others, of course, argue that the comparison of these two things is lacking, or at least is not complete, that it misses some elements, that the relationship between Palestinians and Jews in Israel and Palestine is not just a racial or an ethnic issue, but also a question of a clash between two national peoples over a single territory. And just in the context of our discussion and in the question of the relationship between ideas of Blackness in different parts of the world and how they speak to each other, I'd appreciate it if you could say a few words about your thoughts on that. So we'll start with you, Shula, a few words, and then Brian and Yuval, please.
Well, the last 2 years, especially the last year, I see as an activist, I see more and more linkage between Ethiopian Israeli activists and Mizrahi activists who described themselves as a shchorim. We all shchorim, and sometimes we are fighting who is shchorim be'emet, who is really shchorim, right? Who is really black, yeah? So anyways, but in the end, we understood that we have to fight together. We have to combine the power between us in order to change the situation and the reality in Israel. So after George Floyd killed by police in America, there was a lot of Arabs and Ethiopians and Mizrahim, also our Ashkenazim partners. We went together, we went out, we went to the Embassy of America, and we go out to the Prime Minister office, in front of Prime Minister office, and we speak about Black Lives Matter. So we sometimes doing a differentiation between the color tone, but a real thing or the real goal is to change the system and to make the reality good for all people in Israel and in the world too.
Thanks, Shula. Brian, Palestinians and Blackness in Israel?
Ooh, okay. I'm really going to try to keep this short. So cut me off if I just continue rambling. So, I mean, it's such a difficult question for me in particular, because using my own framework, as a Black American scholar and Jewish scholar as well, thinking about Palestinians, what I think about is a national framework, or how I myself kind of think about it in terms of Palestinian society has its own framework of racial hierarchies that exist, but tend to be kind of muted in favor of the more nationalist framework of liberation for Palestinian peoples, right? The Israeli framework also has its own racial hierarchies that are only put upon for the Jewish members of that Israeli society. And similarly, in the case of the US, we have something where Black Americans are in this like in-between place of like, definitely they're at the core of American identity, but they're not American. They're not really American in the same way that white Americans are. And the parallels that I mostly see with Palestinians is that of Native Americans, where a lot of times, indigenous Americans are not really part of that larger conversation of, anti-police brutality, of Black solidarity efforts. And so that's one thing. The other thing is that when we talk about Black American solidarity with Palestinians and Israel and all that Israel has jurisdiction over, all the peoples that they have jurisdiction over, a lot of that is really centering American Ashkenazi Jewish institutions, in that the solidarity efforts, at least how I've been seeing them historically speaking, at least from the 60s until now, has been that Black institutions in the US had this rift that occurred, or supposed rift that occurred in 67 after that war and the conquering of territories by Israel, in which they didn't feel, as well as the King riots or rebellions that occurred in the US, they didn't feel as if American Jewish institutions were really on the side of Black Americans. As a result, there was a push towards the Arab world in general, but not necessarily Arab Americans, who are still seen as white by Black Americans. And so there's this like very complicated thing that really needs to be fleshed out in terms of Black solidarity, internationally speaking, and how much US politics or domestic politics come into play, whereas there is a rift between Black Americans and Jewish Americans, but also Black Americans and Arab Americans. But then it plays out in Israel because the American Jewish institutions kind of present themselves as white. It plays out in Israel that, well, if the Jews are white here, then they must be white there. And so we can't really have that same solidarity effort for Mizrahim or Beta Israel, who are the Blacks of Israeli Jewish society. I'm going to stop there and kind of leave room for questions, because I'm just throwing a bunch of stuff at a wall and kind of hoping it'll explode, I guess. I don't know, mixing metaphors. Yeah.
I appreciate it very much. Yuval,
I will be really brief to allow enough time for questions.
Excellent.
I will just say that Brian and Shula really raised really important perspectives of it. I will only say that part of this detachment, I will say, that in many ways, the Palestinians are not part of the color spectrum that we imagine in Jewish discourse, or even in the academic discourse about color in Israel. So that you have the spectrum from Beta Israel to the white Ashkenazi, and in the middle, but Palestinians are out of the spectrum. I think part of it is it's the notion that happened in Israeli sociology, the partition between the ethnic question and the national question. So ethnic question of assimilation and separation between different kinds of Jews, adot or ethnic groups, dealt separately from the question of the Palestinian question. That's why we are not dealing with it. I think that part of what I wanted to say in the end, that we need to rethink about it. Because if you put back the context, the localized context of Middle Eastern history, we will think about the color crossing national, but of course, the Palestinians have another line of Arabs that are Black and Arabs that are brown and Arabs are white, and this kind of color questions are going back historically. The Jews are part of it, Jews of the Middle East, Jews that were localized residents of the area. So if we go back to this kind of context, it's very important to exactly bridge this kind of separations.
Super. Thank you so much. And now I'm going to bow out, and Dr. Weiss, over to you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you to our panelists. We have so many amazing questions coming in. Please continue. I will definitely not get to them all, but I will try and combine them and think of themes. So I'm going to actually combine a couple of the questions now. And, there's been a couple of questions about COVID-19, about the vaccines. It was just in the news that Israel is vaccinating asylum seekers who are mainly from Eritrea and Sudan. So I was wondering if all the panelists, and maybe Shula, will start with you because I know you're on the ground, so to speak. What has this been like? I know especially the Ethiopian Israeli community has a complicated history with the medical establishment in Israel. And if you could speak a bit both about the vaccine and also about COVID-19 and how it deals with these issues of Blackness and the themes that we've been thinking about.
Are you asking me or?
Well, if Shula, I figured you might be able to start because you're on the ground.
Okay.
Yes.
I think the COVID-19 show again the problem of inequality between, again, in the end, it's white and black. Because for a month, even more than a month, the Ethiopian community didn't get the explanation and the knowledge about COVID-19. I mean, we tried, we called to Magen David Adom, we called to the health ministry office. No Amharic, nobody can translate it. No meditators, like, and the assumption, actually, after that, I also check about Arabs. They got a little bit earlier because of the number, I guess. So, but COVID-19 is open again. Who needs to live? Who lives as matter? First of all, the white Ashkenazim, people who has money, people knows the language, they have the whole explanation. After that, other groups. I'm not saying just Ethiopians, but in Ethiopia, it's very, very very clear and dramatically affect the community. And I don't know the numbers, but I know a lot of my community died because of like lack of access, lack of language, lack of care. Again, we can explain in different ways. And the bottom line, it's about who is matter to live or not.
Right. Brian or Yuval, do you want to add anything, or maybe speak more generally also about asylum seekers, which is a question we got in the comments that I know we didn't have time to address.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to kind of second Shula's comments. I mean, that is a fantastic way to explain it. And then kind of thinking what it brought to mind was the parallels that we can see both between Mizrahim and Ethiopians and also Beta Israel and Black Americans, in a sense, with COVID. So for the first instance, what I fear is that what people will hear, particularly American audience members or Anglophone, native Anglophone people, is that, well, it's an issue of integration and learning the language, and maybe in the second generation that'll be over. And that's a trope that has been going on with Mizrahim forever since the state has been created. That okay, yes, there's discrimination, I can admit to that. But then in the second generation, they'll be over with integration or intermarriage or learning the language better and things like that. But no, that is not the case. We can already see, if we look at the long history of the state of Israel, that, getting rid of Arabic as, a language in a sense, is, in the beginning of the state, it was very much, kind of geared towards, not necessarily integrating Palestinian citizens, but really kind of acknowledging the fact that, hey, yeah, there's a lot of Jews here. And then later, the majority of Jews here are Arabic speakers, right? But then later that gets rid of, right? And so is the answer to, produce more materials in Amharic and have people speak Amharic and learn it? Yes, absolutely. But that's not the only answer to that. That's not the only solution to that. The other aspect of thinking about parallels between Black Americans and Ethiopian Jews in Israel is, the lack of information. The people who have suffered the most under COVID-19 in the US case has been Black Americans, and then to a lesser extent, Hispanic Americans, or Latinx folks. And why is that? Is it, a language issue? No. At its core, it's about whose lives matter, right? Who actually does the state care for and make sure that they, remain alive, they remain healthy and, successful in their lives. And it's not Black people. And that's the case in both Israel and the US, right? It's not about Black people. And so we can think about the different strategies that are used by the state to reinforce that notion that Black lives don't matter. Those strategies are different in some ways and similar in other ways, but at its core, it is about, as Shula said, Black lives don't matter. And we're trying to make sure that we're trying to make sure that people know that Black lives actually do matter. And that's in that case. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Okay, I would say maybe something about the African asylum seekers. I think in many ways to say something about Africa and about the land, because part of what we're speaking about is the whitening and the blackening of the geography of the land itself. So the fact that Israel is protecting itself as Western state or it's not part of Asia, but in the same time, most people doesn't understand that we are really on the border of Africa and Israel and Africa, and Brian is doing a lot of really important work, and I'm looking forward to his next book, Brian, about this kind of notions. But I think that part of what the asylum seekers, of course, the Afro-Jews that came from North Africa, and then the Beta Israel that came, brought Africa to Israel in many sense. But I think the asylum seekers show that we have this border. We are close to this continent, that we are part of the problems that happen in Africa, are coming to our land. So I think this kind of notion of Africa and the closeness to Africa and Asia, of course, for our location was exposed by this, the arrival of asylum seekers. The second thing is the notion of what now people are calling Black geographies, that you have asylum seekers that coming to neighborhoods that used to be populated by Mizrahi Jews, and then maybe Beta Israel, and now it's a Black geography that is, of course, combining inequality that is class based and race based and spatial based, geographical based. So it's another layer that these kind of asylum seekers are bringing to us. And of course, the question of Jewish identity and color and the boundaries of non-Jews and Jews that are Black. It's another, of course, important issue that bring it with it. And of course, the racism, open racism that comes with it. But I will stop here.
Okay. So thank you. We have so many questions coming in. In lieu of one last question, I just want to mention some of them so I can leave you all with something to think in the 3 minutes we have left, right? Questions about the Jews in Uganda who recently were denied the right to immigrate to Israel, questions about how this plays out in film and literature, colonialism, issues of diaspora. So Yuval, I'm really glad you mentioned Black geographies, homogenization. There's so much to think about. There's so much for us to read in our email, which will include a recording to the event and according to event, we will also include links to some of the things that our panelists mentioned. I again want to thank everyone. I want to thank Brian, Yuval, Shula, Alex for moderating, the Schusterman Center, the Jewish Studies Department, Neges, and the Faculty Co-Curricular Fund for supporting us. Again, thank you all so much for joining us, and we hope to see you again at another Schusterman event. Thank you.